Hi everyone, it's Dr. Hall. Welcome to Lecture 18. We're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. The plan for this lecture is to first talk about some of the structural and functional divisions of the nervous system. A lot of that will be review, but I think it's important to get our bearings and have the appropriate perspective so we know just what it is we're talking about. And then we're going to talk about the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, which are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. And then if we have time, I'm going to see how long these lectures end up being. We're going to do some case studies, which are really fun. If we don't have time to do it in the lecture, we'll do it in lab. So let's talk about divisions of the nervous system. Scientists love dividing things into different categories because that helps us to understand them and it also helps us to remember them and conceptualize them. So we can do so structurally or anatomically by like where the things are. And so the divisions for the nervous system then would be the central nervous system, shown here in purple, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And when we're in the central nervous system, if we have a bundle of axons running together, we're going to call that usually a tract, right? So lateral cortical spinal tract, for example, or the spinothalamic tract. Or maybe a fasciculus, like the arcuate fasciculus that we learned about for the language areas, or maybe even a commissure, like the anterior commissure or the hippocampal commissure for fibers going across from one side to the other. And also when we're in the central nervous system, so this is just vocab review, if we have a cluster of neurons together that are forming a little group, that's often referred to as a nucleus. Then out in the peripheral nervous system, we have all the nerves, right? So this is everything other than the brain and spinal cord. We have all the nerves, and which are just bundles of axons, but out in the peripheral nervous system, we call them nerves. And then we also have clusters of neuron cell bodies, and those are called ganglia. So we've already learned about the dorsal root ganglion, which we find just outside of the spinal cord, where we're going to find the cell bodies of our sensory neurons, the first order sensory neurons. We're going to meet some other ganglia in this lecture. We can also divide things up by what are they doing, right? So what are their functions? So these kind of functional divisions. And again, this should sound very familiar to you. So the sensory or afferent is how it's really pronounced, but I'll often say afferent, so it's clear which word I'm using, is bringing signals from the this is wrong, from the body into the into the CNS from the body. Why did I put it in that order? I don't know, that's really weird. So, right, so, whether it's vision or touch or proprioception, this is information that is coming into the central nervous system from the body. And then motor or efferent is, of course, going from the central nervous system, whether it's the brain or the spinal cord or a combination, and sending things out to the body. We're usually sending it to something then to make it do something. So they show you here in the diagram a muscle that's an effector. It's going to do the effect. It's going to make the thing happen. We're going to talk more about effectors today. Then we can also talk about which kind of parts of the body is it talking to, because it turns out that whether we're talking about the meat skeleton or the squishy bits inside. So your meat skeleton, your bones, your muscles, and the skin that covers them, that is your somatic nervous system. And so we have just learned about the somatosensory system and the somatic motor system. So we learned about the sensory and motor systems for those parts of our bodies. Turns out when it comes to the squishy bits inside, our inner organs, those are our viscera. Viscera is kind of a fancy word for guts. That's a different nervous system that is supplying the visceral areas of our body. So for somatic, as I just mentioned before, we already learned the somatosensory system and we already learned the somatic motor system, which is for our voluntary actions. When it's visceral, we're talking about sensations that are coming from these inner organs. So you might remember that when we learned about the chemical senses and we learned about the chemoreceptor trigger zone in the medulla and the vomiting center, and we learned that the vomiting center gets input from the vagus nerve with sensory input from our intestines, right? So if something's feeling really bad in your intestines, that's going to trigger that vomiting center, and that's going to travel through the vagus nerve. Remember, the vagus nerve also does sensory input from the chemoreceptors from your aortic bodies, just a little reminder. And then we have visceral motor, and these are involuntary actions. So somatic motor is things that you do with your skeletal muscles, the things that move your body. Visceral motor, this is stuff in your guts, right? So the peristalsis of food through your intestinal tract, the squirting of saliva out of your salivary glands. This is the autonomic nervous system. Now, some people will say that the autonomic nervous system is just the visceral motor piece of things. Some people will say the autonomic nervous system is the visceral motor and visceral sensory. I don't care. So we'll just learn the different divisions of it. Most of it is motor. Some also say it's a division of the peripheral nervous system, but there's some parts of it that are in the central nervous system, so that never made sense to me. Anyway, so let's talk a moment about visceral sensation, because most of the rest of this lecture is going to be about visceral motor control, which is most of what the autonomic nervous system is. So visceral sensation is often pretty vague and nonspecific. We talked about this a little bit before when we talked about nociception and pain phenomenon. And what you're seeing here in this diagram is actually a depiction of the vagus nerve. So that vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, you have one on each side. It's coming out from the brainstem here, one on each side, and it travels down your neck. It travels right alongside your carotid arteries and your jugular veins. It travels right down through the neck, and then it goes way down into your thoracic cavity, supplies the heart and lungs, and then also down into much of your abdominal cavity. So you might remember that when we first learned the vagus nerve, I told you that the word comes from the Latin for wanderer. That's where the term vagrant comes from, the same root. So this nerve goes everywhere. So much of visceral sensation, so we learned from the intestines, but also from your heart, from your lungs, from your kidneys, also is carried up through the vagus nerve. So vagus nerve is kind of a big deal. We're going to talk about it a lot. So one example of how these visceral sensations are usually pretty vague and indistinct would be the classic, what we call presentation or sequence of symptoms that occurs in a child who has appendicitis, or interestingly, an adult. I had a returning student who took my anatomy and physiology class. We talked about this in lecture, and wouldn't you know it, a week later, they got appendicitis. And they were like, thank goodness we had that lecture. It saved my life. I got to the hospital in time. So anyway, so the appendix is this funny little doodad that is on the beginning part of your large intestine, and it's located way down in the lower right part of your abdomen. But when it first gets inflamed and infected and irritated, it's part of your viscera, it's part of your guts. So the symptoms that you get, the sensation of discomfort, is pretty vague and diffuse, and interestingly, it's often located around your belly button. So a lot of times kids who have early appendicitis, they come in pointing to their belly button as the area where it hurts, but they can't describe it very specifically. But then what happens is, as the appendicitis gets worse and it gets more inflamed and it starts to irritate the structures around it, one of the structures that it irritates is the inside of your abdominal wall, your meat skeleton. So it's actually irritating the insides of those muscles, those abdominal muscles that you have that normally hold all your guts in. And those have somatic sensation, and so it's very specific. So the classic symptoms of appendicitis in terms of the pain are that it starts around the belly button, and then it gradually, and it's kind of vague and just feels wrong and icky, and then it moves down into that right lower abdomen and becomes very sharp and very distinct. And so that is the classic presentation of appendicitis. Visceral sensory and somatic sensory, very different. You might also remember referred pain. So these sensory nerve fibers from our viscera, so these visceral afferents, come into the spinal cord very close to the same places as the somatic sensory. And so sometimes our brain can't tell the difference. And in fact, as you see here, sometimes they'll even synapse with the same second order neuron. So like literally there's no way for the brain to tell the difference from where it's coming from. And most of the time the sensory information that we get is from our somatic system. So a lot of time the brain just assumes it's there. So I like this diagram because I think it does a really nice job of showing you how it's easy to get those signals confused. But I also just want to point out, like, the area of referred pain for the stomach is not the hand, okay? It's actually like the front of your abdominal wall, like, or the middle of your back. It is not your hand. So I don't know why they picked the hand. But anyway, remember referred pain. And there are some classic locations that different organs can refer pain to. You might remember we talked about gallbladder and diaphragm and how, after I had my C-section, there was air trapped underneath my diaphragm and I had this terrible pain in my shoulder that eventually, as the air dissolved, it went away. Same thing for the heart, right? So you might have chest pain, or it might go down your arm, and this diagram was imperfect, it might actually go up into your neck if you're having a heart attack. So we can see lots of different locations here for that referred pain. They left off uterus, but I think it's one that a lot of people have familiarity with. So the uterus can cause referred pain. Usually the location is to the lower back. So if you've ever heard about someone who in childbirth says that they had back labor, that's referred pain. Also, similarly, sometimes people who have significant menstrual cramps will feel low back pain, and that will sometimes be worse than any pain that they're having down in the pelvic area would be that severe referred pain. So just a reminder there. So we have somatic and visceral motor. So our involuntary or automatic stuff is the autonomic nervous system. So that's a nice way to remember it, is the autonomic nervous system is the automatic nervous system. Involuntary things that happen without you making them do so. So what are some of those involuntary visceral actions, right? So a lot of the time it's secreting things from glands. So tearing, so your lacrimal glands. Remember we learned about your tear glands up here in your eyes. That is actually an involuntary thing, right? When you're cutting onions, you don't say, I wanna really tear up now. No, right? It just happens. Salivation is another one. Sweating, right? So glands are secreting things. And then there are the involuntary muscles. So it could be the smooth muscle in your intestines that's peristalsing and squeezing your food through. It could be the smooth muscle in the ureters, which squeeze the newly made urine from the kidneys down into your bladder, or in the wall of the bladder itself when it's time for your bladder to empty to help you urinate. Also, we have smooth muscle in the walls of our arteries, and when it contracts, they narrow down and constrict, and when it relaxes, they open up and dilate. Can you see that? It's very hard for me. Okay. And then, of course, the heart. So the heart is involuntary. It's autorhythmic. Now, the heart, interestingly, it'll do its own thing. In the absence of any nervous system innervation whatsoever, the heart will beat at a set rhythm, but we can speed it up or slow it down. And the part of the nervous system that we're going to use to do that with is the autonomic nervous system. We can also increase the force of contractions, again, through the autonomic nervous system, make it beat harder. So the autonomic nervous system has two divisions. So just reminding us, we already learned about our somatic things to the left of this line. So now we're talking about visceral. I talked a little bit about sensory, and it looks like I did a very bad job with animations here. Yep. Okay. So then the motor division has two different types. We've got sympathetic and parasympathetic, and so the rest of this lecture is going to be divided into those two categories. So sympathetic is often known as fight or flight, or some people will talk about fight, flight, or freeze, because a lot of people caught in a crisis will just freeze. And then parasympathetic is often known as the rest and digest system, or you could call it the feed and breed system, because it's also involved with some reproductive functions. So in summary, our structural or anatomic divisions would be central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, versus peripheral nervous system, nerves and ganglia. functional, then we're talking about sensory or afferent versus motor or efferent. And then within each one of those, you have both somatic and visceral, depending on if we're talking about the meat skeleton and the skin that covers it, or the squishy bits inside, your inner organs. Remember that our visceral sensations are pretty vague and diffuse. They're very non-specific. They're hard for the brain to interpret. And sometimes we'll get referred pain because the brain will be like, oh, I think it's actually that somatic sensory nerve that's telling me that it's got pain. And so the wires kind of get crossed. So visceral motor, for our purposes, we're going to talk about that as the autonomic or automatic motor system, nervous system. So that's all our involuntary or automatic functions, like contraction of the smooth muscles, regulation of cardiac muscles, and activity of glands. Don't forget those. And it's going to be subdivided into sympathetic, fight or flight, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. So we'll pick up with sympathetic nervous system next. See you there.